Comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. One of the questions that I hear often, and I actually think I'm starting to hear it a lot more in recent years as people become more comfortable with being open about being secular humanist or being atheist or agnostic, is this: you believe in God. If there's a God, why does God allow evil to exist? And they're not afraid to say it to a minister anymore. I think there was a time, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, where people might have had that question, but they were too polite to ask. Now people are asking, if there is a God, why does God allow evil to exist? And what goes with that question is, because evil exists, I can't believe there's a God. People look at war and war crimes. People look at racism, homophobia, economic inequity. They look at hunger and starvation. They look at the lack of affordable housing or the lack of affordable health care. They look at children or young adults dying of cancer or anyone dying of cancer, and they go, how can there be a God with all these things existing? And it doesn't seem to matter whether the suffering is human caused or caused by nature. The question is always the same. If there's a God, how can God allow these things to happen? And the argument kind of goes like this: God could stop these things and doesn't, so God is not good. Or God cannot stop these things and God is not powerful. And if either is true, God fails to meet the definition of God, all good and all powerful. So I really feel the emotion that comes behind this question. If there is a God, why does God allow evil to exist? Because people have spent nights up all night wondering that. They have asked that to sometimes dozens or hundreds of people and not really felt they got an answer to their question. And I'm not sure I can answer that question either, but I'm going to try. And we're going to use this story that Jesus tells, a parable, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, to kind of frame the question and perhaps explore some answers. So, Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? And he answered, an enemy has done this. And the slaves said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? And he replied, no, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So what do we take away from this story? Well, here's some things that come to my mind every time I read this parable. First, there is good and evil in this world. There's weed and there's wheat and there's weeds. There's both. And there's weed too, and you can decide whatever that is. But there is good and evil in this world. They're both happening. They're both there. And I do think that that's something that we have to come to grips with. We can't pretend that there isn't evil in our world. We can't pretend that bad things don't happen. Pollyannish thinking is not going to get us anywhere. And secondly, if there is a master of the house, if there is a God, God does allow the weeds to grow with the wheat. Evil is allowed to coexist with the good. And then finally, the last thing I see in this story is that this will not go on forever. There's always a harvest time, right? The growing season always comes to an end. And at some point, evil will end and good will be harvested. So probably the question you're wondering is, why are weeds allowed to grow with the wheat? Why does evil get to exist alongside good? Why does that have to happen? And that's kind of the question that the workers in the story ask. Do you want us to go and gather the weeds? And the master says, no, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Now, I know that answer doesn't really jive with 21st century farming technology. We can target the weeds with herbicides and we can keep the wheat. Man, we can even do that on our front lawn. But the point of the story is that God lets everything grow, wheat and weeds, good and evil. That's the way it is right now. And it's not until things are grown that wheat is gathered into the barn and the weeds are burned. So, why does that happen? Well, let's take a stab at that. First, sometimes it's hard to tell what a thing is when it begins. Is this thing good? Is this thing evil? We have a history of sometimes mistaking the identity of what is happening around us. We have a history as the human race of calling good things bad and bad things good. And usually change and transition generates those cases of mistaken identity. In the life and ministry of Jesus and all of history, there are stories in which a good thing comes along and it is mistaken for evil. And sometimes you can't tell right away. And sometimes it takes time for us to figure out what it is. And I think it is good to let things grow a bit and to suspend judgment and to hold off a definitive response until we've had a chance to see, what are we looking at here? What is happening here? I might be uncomfortable. I might not like this. This might be disruptive, but maybe this is what we need. I think as a society, we are going through that all the time. Even wearing a mask has somehow been declared evil, and we're going to protest it. But I think statistics say that most of us recognize now that that is a good thing. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, the battle line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And I think it's important to remember that when we're looking at the people in our lives and the things people are doing. Everybody is capable of either choice, good or evil. And just because we think it's evil doesn't mean it is. And we need some time to see how it is going and growing and how it turns out. Secondly, in terms of why evil and good are allowed to coexist, why the weeds get to grow with the wheat, I think adversity builds resiliency. I don't want to be trite about this. I certainly don't want to underestimate or dismiss the pain and suffering that comes from evil. But evil does force the good to adapt, to dig deeper, to get stronger, and to learn to overcome. Something I realized probably about 10 years ago is that it's very difficult to define good in a vacuum. We somehow define good often in response to evil. It's evil that teaches us what the good thing is that needs to be done, that needs to exist in a situation. So racism, homophobia, genocide, disease, natural disaster, all of them horrible. All of these things abhorrent and unwelcome, without question. And yet all of these things have compelled us to act in response, to invent or reinvent, to improvise, to devise, to write, to speak, to act, to counteract the effects of these bad, unwelcome, abhorrent, evil things. They have demanded that we create better laws and develop treatments and cures and take our environment seriously. And for better or worse, and sometimes worse, the human race is a responsive species. I'm not always happy about that, but it seems we often rise to our best when we need to respond to crisis. I wish we could become more proactive instead of reactive, but we do seem to find what we have within when we are responding to something bad or evil going on around us. And then I think the third thing I want to take away from this story, and this is really important. It might be where Dave was going with the question that he set up for us today in the breakout groups. I think we need to remember that people aren't evil. People choose evil. They can also choose good. And I think it's very dangerous to identify some people as weeds and other people as wheat, and then root out the weeds in our lives, root out the people in our lives that we've identified as weeds or wheat or evil, and only keep the people in our lives that we've identified as wheat or good. And the reality is that some people might start off being weeds, and through a series of circumstances or encounters in their lives, become wheat. And the opposite is true as well. But thinking redemptively and thinking with hope and thinking about the work of grace in our lives, the tendency to dismiss people as weeds or as evil, I think, fails to do justice to who every person can become. I think we never want to lose hope that someone who may feel like a weed in our life can become wheat. And we need time for that. And things have to grow for that change to happen. Pope Francis said, although the life of a person is in a land full of thorns and weeds, there is always a space in which the good seed can grow. You have to trust God. And that's, as tough as it is, how I want to think about the people in our lives. There's always space in which a good seed can grow. You have to trust God. Sometimes you have to do a little prompting too, but you have to trust God. Well, I'll be honest with you. Even though I've tried to find something redemptive about weeds and wheat growing in our lives, about the coexistence of evil and good, good and evil, it is sometimes exhausting and overwhelming. And if you're feeling that way about evil, I get it. I'm there with you. And sometimes it is very easy to ask, why does God allow evil to continue? I just can't take any more. And I certainly don't think we should ever judge people that are thinking and feeling that, because I'm going to guess that we're all going to go there at some point. At times, we're going to feel like life would be so much better if God would just remove evil from this world. But for now, in the life we presently know, we contend with both. We get both, good and evil. We get wheat and weeds. We are given the opportunity to work for good now, to respond to evil with good, and to believe that someday the good we have grown will remain. It will be harvested, and the evil will pass away forever. Not now, but someday. So, despite the weeds we see, despite the evil we see, let us keep growing good in our world. Let us keep growing the wheat. No good we do now will be lost or forgotten, despite the presence of evil. No good we do now will be lost or forgotten. All of it is going to be harvested, and all of it is making the world different here and now. Amen.